Welcome to my YouTube channel. My guest on Facing the Canon today is Rachel Newham, and we will be talking about the very important subject of mental health. Rachel Newham, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you, good to be here.
I've loved reading your story, and you were brought up in a Christian home.
Yeah.
And there's certain things that stood out for me. When you were 5,
Yes.
you were praying for the Rwandan genocide at the age of 5.
Yeah, I was probably a touch precocious, but I became a Christian at 5, and I think it was 1994, 95. And so the news was full of, I remember Newsround being on the Rwandan genocide. And yeah, just thinking, well, I want to go and be a missionary there then. That's what I'll do. And then I realised that Rwanda's actually quite far away.
Now, as you grew up, you're going into your teenage years, and then this wave of sadness comes into you, and you couldn't stop crying.
Yeah, there were a lot of tissues going on. But it was, I'd been away from home on a holiday with some friends at a camp, and I thought, I guess, initially that it was homesickness because I was crying and I wasn't enjoying myself. And it wasn't until I got home and I was still crying that I just didn't understand what was happening to me. I didn't understand why I was crying. I didn't understand why I felt so sad.
Yeah, I mean, were you and your parents thinking, oh, it might be a bit hormonal or something?
Definitely. I thought that maybe this was just what being a teenager felt like.
Yes, but then that moved into, I think you around the age of 15, you started to self-harm.
Yeah.
Now, what provoked you, or why did you do that?
So it's interesting, I think, and this wasn't conscious at the time, but looking back, I've always had eczema, and I've always had that sense that when you're itching and you get a relief from it, I guess. And I wonder if that maybe helped plant the idea, I don't know. But it was the week of the 7/7 bombings.
Yes.
My best friend's dad was diagnosed with cancer. I just couldn't think of any other way. Crying didn't really work anymore, I guess. I wasn't getting any relief from it. And so I searched for another way to get some of the relief that I craved.
And did it bring any relief?
Yeah, for a short time it did. And I think it's really uncomfortable to talk about the fact that with things like self-harm, in a short-term way, they work in the moment. They don't work in the long term, and they're not healthy or helpful. But they do provide a sense of tension release for a little while. But what happens is almost as soon as the act is over, the tension builds again, which means it can lead to kind of an escalation.
Yes. So looking back, and obviously you've studied a lot. This is an area of your life and vocation now. What would you say to any of our listeners, Rachel, who are currently self-harming? What advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is to find somebody you trust to talk to. And it's really uncomfortable to talk about, and kind of to not be afraid of that uncomfortableness, but find somebody you trust. You might not be able to tell them the reasons and kind of the hows and whys, but just confide in them that you're really struggling, and find some outlets for that feeling of pressure. For some people it's sport, for others it's music, for me often it was writing, but finding a space to kind of release that tension in a different, healthy way is key. When I was younger, I was like, well, I don't care about how I deal with my pain, I just want it to go away. But it wasn't until I got older that I realised that actually in beginning to explore ways to deal with what was happening that were healthier and more constructive, that did help how I was feeling.
Sure, absolutely. And now, it was about the age of around 18 when you were diagnosed with clinical depression.
Yeah.
So Was that a relief to you to actually have a diagnosis? Because for several years you were wondering what's going on with me.
Yeah, it was a massive relief actually, because it just was like, oh, okay, that's why. It's not that there's something inherently bad about me. It's not my fault that this is happening. This is an illness. Okay, I can kind of begin to come to terms with that in a better way.
And then were you prescribed antidepressants?
So I was about 19, so it was about a year later when I was prescribed the medication. And it's not a quick fix.
No.
They're not happy pills. It's just, I often describe it as it's a life raft. So you can float and then you can begin to actually get out of the water. But until then, I certainly wasn't able to even begin to deal with any of the stuff because I was too ill.
So mental health, obviously that's an area you have studied, you talk about. When we say mental health, what do we mean, Rachel?
It's a great question because often when we talk about mental health, what we're actually talking about is mental illness. If I'm doing training and I say, what is mental health? They say depression, anxiety, but they're mental illnesses. Mental health is our wholeness, our well-being. It's, I guess, what makes life worth living. It's community, it's friendship, it's being able to get through hard times and able to flourish and to live well, I guess.
So, right, could you just give us some of the data, some of the statistics? What, Rachel, are we actually talking about? How many people are affected by different disorders?
Yeah, so I guess the most famous statistic is 1 in 4 will suffer with struggle with their mental health in any given year. And that's a vast statistic. And I think sometimes...
So that's 25% of the population?
Yes.
That's
in
hugely significant.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's really important here that we understand that there's a spectrum of mental health issues. So for some people it's going to be really easy to manage on the day-to-day basis, and for others it's going to be life-altering. But it's really important, I think, that we recognise how common mental illness is. But equally that we recognise that it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. So that 25% represents a huge range of different illnesses and different expressions of those illnesses.
Okay, now Rachel, give us some understanding and insight and help. This last year has been very, very complex for all sorts of people in all sorts of situations. So you, having pondered all of this, tell us what the major concerns are regarding mental health and this COVID season.
So I think it kind of falls in two parts. The first is the general, I guess, atmosphere of anxiety. And it's important to note that actually anxiety in and of itself isn't a bad thing. We need a level of anxiety in order to function because it's what keeps us safe. But the fact that we've been bombarded every single day for over a year with horrendous news and been the fear around our families and ourselves and our livelihoods means that anxiety as an emotion has been deep in the air, but also people have been struggling with anxiety disorders. And
can you tell us what disorders would they be?
Yeah, so the most common one is generalised anxiety disorder, which is often characterised by a feeling of dread, and then panic disorder, which has obviously features panic attacks. And then there are kind of other anxiety disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder is also an anxiety disorder. And I think one of the issues is coming out of lockdown is working with people who are really anxious about the end of lockdown as well. So the last year has been crisis mode for so many people, and many might not have even been able to begin to think about how anxious they are or to manage perhaps the grief that they're living through. And so coming out of lockdown and hopefully returning to some kind of normal life, actually we need to be really aware in our churches that for some people lockdown was the biggest struggle, But for others, this next season is going to be equally hard as we readjust to being around people again.
So, okay, let's pick up on that, on both of those. Wow. First of all, lockdown. For some people, being at home, possibly in an abusive marriage or in an abusive situation, your children being at home and you have to do the teaching and you're not able to do the teaching. And, you know, I sometimes think of people, you know, maybe stuck in a high-rise block of flats. I mean, that must have caused a lot. So how are these people who've been affected, how are they going to be helped?
I guess that's the million-dollar question. We don't know. So I think hopefully within schools, and I think we can't underestimate the massive impact that this last year has had on our young people who have missed out on so much socialisation and just like the carefreeness that should come with childhood and adolescence. So I think hopefully there's stuff being put into place in schools with counselling and well-being and kind of a focus on how to live well and how to kind of adjust back into life. But I think this isn't just about there being medical interventions for those with clinical anxiety and clinical depression. This has to be a community thing that actually we're looking after one another. And I think, you know, COVID has shown the power of community again. You know, where we live, there's been coronavirus support groups and kind of people running lifts and doing meals for people who are self-isolating. And I think if we can plug into that and keep that going, but perhaps in different ways, actually that's going to make it a little bit easier because we're going to enable people to feel less alone.
So you mentioned earlier on about coming out of lockdown. Okay, so would we not all be really happy that we're coming out of lockdown?
I think I think there is probably be a general sense of relief that we can search for some kind of new normal. But I also think if your life pre-lockdown, if your job was a real struggle, if you were living with a mental illness like social anxiety and actually leaving the house was a real struggle, then lockdown may have provided a bit of a buffer for you.
Yes.
It may have been, you know, for children who are struggling with really hating school, actually the opportunity not to be at school for a while, even if it was hard at home, might have been a real comfort and relief. And so I think we have to accept that there are a whole realm of emotions coming out of lockdown. It's easy to kind of be like, but surely everyone's really happy about it. And I think there is a lingering fear that actually, you know, COVID hasn't gone away. And so people who are particularly vulnerable or haven't received the vaccine yet are still anxious about it and about its transmission. So
what advice, what encouragement would you give those people who are fearful?
I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in terms of mental health is that we think it's divorced from our physical health. And actually, some of the best things we can do for our mental health are the same that are good for our physical health. So it's getting enough sleep. It's making sure we get outside once a day. It's making sure that we have a kind of range of vitamins and minerals and nutrients in our diet. But it's also talking about it. And there's something about putting voice to our emotions and our feelings, which is really powerful and can help us to, I guess, process it in a way that we can't do when it's all locked inside our head and it's kind of a big soup of anxiety.
Yeah, but also, how about, you know, where do you get the balance? So, for example, yes, we need to get sleep, but we could oversleep as well, can't we? So
routine is really key actually when it comes to sleep, and anyone who has raised a child in any form will know that, you know, sleep routines are important, and we kind of have bedtime routines for young children, but actually adults need that too. We need that sense that our body gets told that we're about to go to sleep. So whether it's a few pages of book and a shower, or a cup of herbal tea or whatever it is. We need to have a routine every evening that helps us, our body signal that we're about to go to sleep now. Trying to go to bed at a similar time every night and wake up at a similar time in the morning. These are all things that can help to improve our sleep.
Now, right, back to your own story, Rachel. Okay, you were diagnosed with depression.
Mm-hmm.
And you received medication, you've had other struggles, but you've pushed through. And I mean, you're a very vibrant, you're an optimistic, positive person. So you didn't wallow, you kind of pressed through. Tell us a little bit more about your story of moving forwards and not being hindered.
I think for many years, actually, there wasn't a lot of moving forwards.
Okay.
And I think for many years I wasn't able to, I was too poorly. And I think we have to be really aware of that when we're walking alongside people with mental illness, that actually we want them to be more positive and to kind of get on with it. But that might not be possible. It can be like saying to somebody with the flu, it's all right, just get up and go for a run. So I think needs to be a real acknowledgement that we have to be meeting people where they are. But also, I think time helps. Giving people time to experience what they need to experience, to cry, to get the help they need without that constant pressure that they need to be doing more all the time. And giving them space in church to just be. But equally, not limiting them. So it can be really hard, I think, to strike that balance between not wanting to push somebody, but giving somebody an opportunity. So throughout the years when I was at my most unwell, I was still serving in church. That's not possible for everyone, but actually for me, that was a real outlet that enabled me to have some space and some real joy in life.
But like, take that, for example, Rachel, that's a choice, isn't it? And you yourself made a choice to serve in church. And do you think sometimes, we make the wrong choices? Our get up and go's got up and gone. So we're like, well, we're not going to bother.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, we have to want to try, I guess. Yes. But I also think that as communities around people who are struggling, we need to help them to know no limits and say, actually, if all you can do today is sit and quietly rest in what's happening in a church service, great. If next week you want to, I don't know, might it be more helpful to be on the sound desk so that you're not having to interact with loads of people, but actually offering space that you don't need to be productive in church. Sometimes it's about sitting at God's feet and saying, okay, do with me what you will. It's that kind of Mary and Martha thing, I guess. But also it's about praying alongside people if they're not able to pray for themselves. It's about praying on their behalf, perhaps, saying, how can I pray for you? Is it a case of, certainly when I was really unwell, my pastor at the time, sometimes our prayer sessions were me crying and him praying. And gradually I began to find a voice and words to pray. But actually I needed that time and space first. And I think too often we want healing to go along our timeline rather than the actual timeline that's going to happen.
Yes. So Psalm 23 says, he makes me lie down.
Yeah.
And sometimes if we don't lie down, God will make us lie down.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's getting that balance between knowing when your body needs to be repaired and restored, and also, stand, walk, run. My colleague, Sam Rennie, was telling us this morning that he and his wife decided to go running, and they couldn't even run around one little field.
Yeah.
But they did, and then they added a bit more on, and then added a bit more on, and added a bit more on, and ended up running 2 half marathons. So it's getting that balance between knowing when to completely rest and then push forward.
And it takes time, doesn't it? I often say for some people, if they are bedbound with illness, the energy it takes somebody to get downstairs and sit on the sofa is almost as much as another person running half marathon.
Yeah.
And it's helping people to walk the steps that they're able to take, but not kind of making judgment, I guess, on their progress.
Yes. Now, throughout your time and years of struggle, you kept your faith. You kept on leaning against, leaning on the Lord. So your faith has sustained you.
Definitely. I always say I never doubted the existence of God, but I asked him some pretty strongly worded questions about where he was and what he was doing. But I think actually that gave me permission and helped me to keep my relationship with God, was actually being honest with him. And I wrote in my diary, my teenage diaries are something to behold.
Yes.
But the struggle was, God, where are you? And I don't know what you're doing, but I'm going to hopefully trust that you're doing something, even though if I have no idea what it is. And I think I learnt to lament without even knowing what it was, I guess. But it was being honest with God. That was what has sustained my faith, I think.
And that is so important in our relationship with God, to be honest. But the thing is, to be honest with God, God already knows the details.
Of course he does.
So it's us, in fact, being honest with ourselves.
Yeah. And I think, but sometimes that comes, I guess, through that prayer. And I always think here about Jesus walking along the road to Emmaus. And he asks Cleopas, why are you so downcast?
Yes.
And he wants Cleopas to tell him, even though he knows. And he lets Cleopas tell him the story of his own last days before he then preaches and opens the scriptures for them.
Absolutely.
And I think that's such a powerful example of the gentleness of Christ with us, and that kind of tandem thing of listening to one another's stories and listening to the wider story of God.
Yeah, I love that story of the two on the Emmaus Road, and I am so encouraged by that, particularly as they were walking in the complete opposite direction to where they should have been, but Jesus was still walking with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that whole, as you said, listening, tell me your story, and then of course Jesus telling them the truth about the story.
And we see it time and again.
We do.
In the Psalms, it's like, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their stories. And my favourite passage is that of Elijah on Mount Horeb, when he's saying, take my life, Lord, I've had enough. And the angel literally comes alongside him and says, sleep, eat, now go and talk to God and say, open that. And I just love that. And I think it's a real encouragement and challenge for us as a church to kind of, I guess, know which bit to do when.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? The advice that's given to the prophet, have a nap and have a snack.
It's great. It's great advice.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Great advice. Do that.
I'm always up for that advice.
Because you need to be restored.
Yeah.
Now, your book, you tell your story in your book, Learning to Breathe, and that's your story.
Yeah.
Great title. Tell us more about the title.
So, I actually started writing bits of it when I was 18, as a kind of record of what I was going through. You'll be pleased to know I'd kind of deleted the teenage angst by the time it got into a book form.
Yes.
But I really felt this sense of I've always struggled to breathe because I have asthma, and that's been a huge part of my life. And as I was reading and writing, that sense that actually the struggles I'd had in terms of asthma and learning to manage that were very much mimicked in my struggles with mental health. That sense of suffocation that came when I was at my lowest, and the sense that actually I needed other people around me to help resuscitate me, and then be able to, I guess, learn to breathe on my own in a new way.
Yes, absolutely. What advice would you give, Rachel, to church leaders and churches in these years ahead in responding to their flock in the area of mental health? What advice would you give?
I think the first thing is to listen to what those people who are struggling are telling you, and perhaps saying about how we do church and how it works. I think we've learned a huge amount over the last year about accessibility in terms of doing stuff online and it not being less. So I think listening to people is really important. I think giving space for lament, giving space for people to cry out to God and say, this hurts, and how can where are you in this, God? And then I think helping people to connect themselves to the story of Scripture, that we are God's people, and that even when God's people have been at their absolute lowest, God continues to walk, God continues to lead them into new places, being a comfort and a guide.
So for you personally, Rachel, the future, how do you see it?
It's an exciting time. The charity I founded a decade ago, I'm moving on from that this week, in fact, to go and work for another charity, exploring this whole issue of how we can best support those with mental illnesses as a church, doing a big research project on how best we can help people, really, and kind of look at the state of mental health in the UK church. So that's the next step, and I've got a book coming out later this year on that whole thing of joy and lament as well. So that they're kind of the two focuses of my work, alongside toddler wrangling.
As well, yeah. Well, Rachel, thank you for sharing with us a little of your own story. Well done for persevering and persisting. Great to see the Lord sustaining you, and I like that word preserve, because I think the Lord has preserved you, hasn't he? And preserved you for a time such as this, and thank you for your insights and your wisdom. Rachel, thank you for joining us on Facing the Canon.
Thank you for having me.
Well, was that good to talk to Rachel, particularly for a time such as this, as so many, as Rachel said, 25% of the population struggle with something to do with mental health. I hope you found that helpful. I hope it's given you a faith lift. If you do need any help, if you're struggling with a mental health issue, please reach out to family, friends, and to other services that are available that can help you in your journey. Thank you so much for joining us on Facing the Canon.